In this episode, we're going to look at endpoint security as a design problem rather than a product decision, because endpoints are where real people touch real work, and that contact point creates both value and risk. An endpoint can be a laptop, a desktop, a phone, a tablet, or even a specialized workstation, and in many environments it is the first place an attacker tries to gain a foothold. Endpoints are also where mistakes happen naturally, like clicking the wrong link, installing a questionable app, or saving sensitive data in the wrong place. And those everyday behaviors can become security incidents if architecture does not account for them. What makes endpoint security tricky is that you need protection that is strong enough to matter, but also quiet enough that users can still function without constantly fighting the controls. The focus today is building an endpoint security strategy that covers personal devices, mobile devices, and monitoring technologies while staying grounded in identity, data protection, and operational reality. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A mature endpoint security design begins by acknowledging that not all endpoints are the same, and the biggest beginner mistake is to treat every device as if it has equal trust and equal control. Corporate-owned devices are typically easier to manage because the organization can define baseline configurations, enforce updates, and apply monitoring consistently. Personal devices are different because ownership creates limits on what you can install, what you can inspect, and what you can require, even when a user is doing work on that device. Mobile devices are different again because their operating models, app ecosystems, and network patterns do not match traditional desktops. These differences matter because endpoint security is not just about stopping malware. It is about controlling identity, controlling data access, and ensuring that a compromised device does not become a bridge into more sensitive systems. A well-architected program defines categories of devices, defines what each category is allowed to access, and designs compensating controls for the categories that cannot be managed as strongly. The phrase "bring your own device," BYOD, refers to personal devices used for work, and it forces architects to balance security goals with privacy expectations and practical limits. A BYOD design can fail in two opposite ways, either by being so permissive that personal devices become an uncontrolled access path, or by being so strict that users bypass the rules to get their work done. The core security problem is that personal devices may not be patched on time, may have risky software, may be shared with family members, or may be lost, and the organization cannot assume it can fully control those factors. A solid design approach is to treat BYOD as a separate trust tier with carefully limited access, often focused on specific applications rather than broad network presence. This is also where clear identity and authorization become essential, because you cannot compensate for weak device control by assuming the network is trusted. When you treat BYOD as a defined, restricted access model rather than a vague convenience, it becomes manageable instead of chaotic. Mobile devices deserve their own architectural attention because they behave differently in how they store data, how they connect, and how users interact with them. Phones and tablets move between networks constantly, switching from cellular to home Wi-Fi to public hotspots, and that mobility increases exposure to untrusted environments. Mobile apps also have different permission models and data storage behaviors than traditional desktop applications, which means sensitive information can end up cached in places users do not realize. Another important difference is that mobile devices often rely on biometric unlock and short sessions, which can improve usability but can also create a false sense of security if device compromise occurs through stolen accounts or malicious apps. In endpoint security design, mobile is often where you focus on controlling the work container, controlling identity, and limiting the amount of sensitive data stored locally. You also think carefully about what happens when a mobile device is lost, because loss is common, and your design should assume that loss will happen. When mobile security is designed as part of a broader identity and data model, it supports productivity without turning mobility into uncontrolled risk. A foundational concept that ties desktops, BYOD, and mobile together is device trust, which is your decision about what the system should assume about a device before granting access. Trust is not binary, and a strong design avoids the trap of calling a device trusted just because it is inside the office or connected through a private network. Device trust is built from signals such as whether the device is managed, whether it is encrypted, whether it is updated, and whether it is running required protections. But the deeper point is that trust should be earned and continuously evaluated. Beginners often expect a one-time check, like enrolling a device and then treating it as safe forever, but devices change through updates, new apps, and user behavior. A durable endpoint architecture includes ongoing checks and the ability to change access decisions when trust conditions change. This is especially important for BYOD and mobile, where you have less direct control and must rely on measurable conditions rather than assumptions. When trust is dynamic, your security posture can adapt without needing constant manual intervention. Identity is at the center of endpoint security because most modern attacks aim to obtain credentials and then act as legitimate users. If an attacker steals a password or token, they may not need to exploit a device further because they can access systems through valid channels and blend into normal traffic. This is why endpoint security design must connect tightly to authentication strength, session management, and account recovery workflows. The endpoint is the place where credentials are entered, stored, cached, and reused, which means endpoint compromise can directly lead to identity compromise. A sound architecture, therefore, tries to reduce credential exposure by using secure authentication methods, minimizing long-lived secrets on endpoints, and limiting what a single set of credentials can access. It also recognizes that users will sign in from multiple devices, so access decisions should consider both who the user is and what device is being used. When identity and endpoint posture reinforce each other, stealing credentials becomes less powerful because access still depends on trusted device conditions. That combined approach helps prevent a single phishing event from turning into widespread compromise. Data protection is another endpoint design pillar because endpoints are where data gets downloaded, edited, copied, and shared, often in ways that are hard to track. A beginner might focus on preventing malware, but many real data incidents involve legitimate tools used on compromised or unmanaged endpoints. The architecture needs to decide what data is allowed to live on endpoints, in what form, and for how long, because the safest data is data that never leaves controlled repositories. In practice, people need local access for offline work, performance, or convenience, so the design often includes encryption on devices, controlled application storage, and limits on exporting sensitive data. It also includes guardrails on sharing pathways, such as limiting whether sensitive data can be copied into personal email or consumer storage services. For BYOD, data protection often means keeping data inside approved applications and preventing local storage or uncontrolled copying where possible. For corporate devices, it often means full disk encryption, controlled backups, and monitored access to sensitive repositories. When data rules are explicit, endpoint security becomes less about chasing every threat and more about minimizing the value of what a compromised endpoint can expose. Endpoint detection and response, EDR, is one of the most discussed modern endpoint controls, and beginners should think of it as visibility plus action rather than as a simple antivirus replacement. EDR aims to detect suspicious behaviors on an endpoint, such as unusual process activity, credential dumping attempts, or malicious persistence, and it often supports response actions like isolating a device or killing a process. The key architectural value of EDR is that it helps you see what is happening on endpoints at scale, which is crucial because you cannot manually inspect every device. However, EDR is not a guarantee of prevention because attackers can sometimes bypass detection, and legitimate tools can be used maliciously in ways that are hard to label. An EDR strategy must therefore include clear expectations about what it can detect, how alerts are handled, and what response actions are safe and appropriate for different device categories. It also must consider privacy and scope, especially for BYOD, where deep endpoint monitoring may not be acceptable or legally appropriate. When EDR is integrated into a broader design that includes segmentation, identity controls, and data minimization, it becomes a powerful detection layer rather than a false promise of total protection. Host-based intrusion detection system, HIDS, and host-based intrusion prevention system, HIPS, are related concepts that help beginners understand the difference between observing suspicious activity and actively blocking it. HIDS focuses on detecting indicators such as file integrity changes, suspicious configuration modifications, and behavior patterns that suggest compromise. HIPS goes a step further by attempting to block or prevent certain actions, such as stopping known exploit behaviors or preventing unauthorized modifications. The important architectural point is that prevention controls can reduce risk, but can also disrupt normal operations if they are overly strict or poorly tuned. In endpoint environments with many different applications, aggressive prevention can create productivity failures that lead users and teams to seek workarounds. Detection-focused approaches often have fewer operational side effects, but require mature monitoring and response processes, because detection without action is just a notification. A good design chooses where prevention is justified, such as on high-value administrative endpoints, and where detection is the safer default, such as on diverse user devices. When HIDS and HIPS concepts are applied thoughtfully, they help you build layered defenses that respect operational realities. One of the most practical endpoint security decisions is how to handle administrative privileges, because many endpoint compromises become serious only when attackers gain elevated rights. If users run with administrator privileges all the time, then a malicious attachment or a fake installer can change system settings, disable protections, and persist more easily. If administrative privileges are tightly controlled, many attacks are contained to the user context and are easier to clean up. Beginners sometimes think removing admin rights is a small policy tweak, but it changes how software gets installed, how troubleshooting happens, and how users perceive control over their devices. The architectural approach is to design a privileged access model that still supports legitimate needs, such as providing controlled elevation for approved tasks and ensuring IT support can perform maintenance without sharing powerful credentials broadly. This also ties into monitoring, because privileged actions should be more visible and more auditable than ordinary actions. When privilege is constrained and observable, endpoint security becomes more resilient because attackers have a harder time turning a single click into full system control. Patch and configuration management are less exciting than detection technologies, but they are core to endpoint security because many endpoint attacks rely on exploiting known weaknesses. A durable design does not assume perfect patching, but it treats patching as a system capability with clear policies and predictable outcomes. For corporate devices, the design should define update expectations, how quickly critical fixes are applied, and how exceptions are handled when an application breaks after an update. For BYOD, patch enforcement may be limited, so the design often uses access restrictions, such as requiring minimum versions or denying access when a device is too far out of date. Configuration management matters because default settings and convenience features can expand attack surface, such as enabling unnecessary services or allowing risky scripting capabilities broadly. Beginners often assume the endpoint is a personal space and configuration is a user preference. But from a security perspective, consistent configuration is part of maintaining a defensible baseline. When updates and configurations are treated as architecture, they become reliable and less disruptive, which keeps protections in place rather than being resisted. Application control is another area where endpoint security can either become very strong or very frustrating, depending on how it is designed. The basic idea is deciding what software is allowed to run and what software should be blocked, because many endpoint attacks depend on executing untrusted code. If you can limit execution to known, approved software, you reduce the chance that random downloads and malicious attachments become active threats. The risk is that overly strict controls can block legitimate work, especially in environments where users need specialized tools or where workflows change frequently. A mature design often uses tiered control, where high-risk endpoints have stricter rules and general user endpoints use more flexible policies combined with stronger monitoring. It also focuses on limiting the most dangerous execution paths, like untrusted code running from temporary locations or unapproved scripting environments used for automation by attackers. For mobile devices, application control often looks different. focusing on approved app stores and managed app sets. But the same principle holds. Reduce the pathways for untrusted software. When application control is aligned with user needs and supported by good processes for adding legitimate tools, it becomes a sustainable security layer rather than a constant battle. Network and endpoint security meet at a critical point when endpoints become bridges between trust zones, which is common in remote work and BYOD scenarios. A remote device may be connected to a home network filled with other consumer devices, and if that endpoint also has access to corporate systems, it can become a pathway for threats to move. This is why endpoint design often includes controls that limit lateral movement and reduce the chance that one endpoint compromise leads to broader compromise. It also includes careful decisions about what network access remote endpoints receive, favoring access to specific applications rather than broad internal network reach. For mobile devices, the same risk appears when devices connect to public networks and still access sensitive services. The architectural objective is to prevent endpoints from becoming universal keys that open every door, and to ensure that even when an endpoint is compromised, the attacker's reach is limited. This is where segmentation, least privilege access, and conditional access decisions work together. When endpoint security is integrated with network boundaries, the environment becomes harder to traverse even for attackers who gain initial access. Logging, telemetry, and response are what turn endpoint security from a set of controls into an operational capability, because you cannot defend what you cannot see and you cannot improve what you cannot measure. Endpoint logs can reveal patterns like repeated failed logins, suspicious process execution, unusual access to credential stores, and unexpected connections to external destinations. The architecture must decide what telemetry is collected, how it is protected, and how it is used, because collecting everything without a plan creates noise and cost, while collecting too little creates blind spots. Response planning matters because endpoints are where rapid containment can be effective, such as isolating a device to prevent spread while preserving evidence for investigation. However, response actions must be designed carefully to avoid disrupting critical work unnecessarily, especially for devices used in sensitive roles like administrators or executives. This is also where user communication becomes part of security, because users need to understand what to do when their device is flagged, and confusion can slow containment. When telemetry and response are planned as part of architecture, endpoint security becomes faster, calmer, and more reliable during real incidents. A frequent beginner misunderstanding is to think that stronger endpoint security always means installing more agents, but mature architecture is often more about reducing reliance on the endpoint being perfect. Even the best monitored device can be compromised, and even well-managed devices can be misused by legitimate credentials. The most resilient endpoint strategy therefore reduces the value of compromise through data minimization, reduces blast radius through segmentation, and reduces identity abuse through strong authentication and conditional access. It also uses layered controls so that if one layer fails, others still apply, such as combining patching, privilege control, application control, and monitoring rather than betting everything on one tool. For BYOD and mobile, the architecture often shifts to emphasizing controlled access to specific services and limiting local data storage, because deep management may not be feasible. This is not a downgrade. It is a realistic design choice aligned to the responsibility and control boundary. When you think this way, endpoint security becomes a set of coordinated decisions rather than an arms race of software on devices. As we close, the central lesson is that endpoint security design is about aligning device categories, trust assumptions, and control layers so that access and data use remain defensible under real-world conditions. Bring your own device, BYOD, requires a separate trust model that limits access and focuses on protecting data through controlled applications and strong identity checks. Mobile devices require special attention to mobility, local data handling, and loss scenarios so that convenience does not become uncontrolled exposure. Endpoint detection and response, EDR, adds visibility and response capability, but it must be integrated with clear workflows and realistic expectations about detection limits. Host-based intrusion detection system, HIDS, and host-based intrusion prevention system, HIPS, Concepts help you choose where detection is enough and where prevention is justified, with careful attention to operational impact. Across all of this, least privilege, update discipline, application control, and tight integration with network and identity boundaries keep endpoints from becoming hidden trust bridges. When your design makes it clear who can access what from which devices, what data is allowed to live on endpoints, and how suspicious behavior is detected and contained, you've built endpoint security that supports real work without relying on fragile assumptions.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.